As we've seen in this retrospective, Disney's animated movies up to this point largely stayed in fantasy worlds or times gone by. Dumbo took place in the 40s, but it was easy to overlook since most of the action stayed under the big top. 101 Dalmatians was probably the most notable story to be set in contemporary times, and our subject for today took that idea even further. 1988's Oliver and Company, loosely based on Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, was set in modern-day New York. The asphalt jungle was an entirely new setting for Disney. The movie still has its touches of whimsy, like talking animals who do the occasional production number, but it didn't shy away from the harsher realities of the city. Our heroes are destitute and under the enormous thumb of a cold-hearted mobster. For this video, we'll be covering that mobster, Sykes, and his ferocious Dobermans. There is not a lot of documentation on the making of Oliver and Company, but I was fortunately able to interview the director, George Scribner, to clarify some details. That interview will be uploaded separately. But first, the original novel. Dickens was very big on social reform. Oliver Twist shed light on the harsh plights of orphans who were forced into workhouses and worse, under terrible conditions. The titular character's journey starts at one of these, where he famously asks for a second helping of gruel. After a series of mistreatments by authority figures, Oliver runs away to London. He meets a pickpocket called the Artful Dodger, who takes him to the home of Fagin. Fagin is an old criminal who has trained many like Dodger to do his bidding. One of his former trainees is the brutish Bill Sykes, who's graduated from child thief to a professional burglar. His lover, Nancy, is initially as bad as the rest of them, but soon takes pity on Oliver and does what she can to save him. Sykes ends up killing her for her troubles, and then dying himself when he runs from the police. Sykes' only companion is his bull terrier, Bullseye, who is just as vicious as his master. Sykes is a violent criminal, but not exactly the brightest. Fagin is the mastermind, and has probably created other Bill Sykes types over his career. The Disney version largely changed this, and made Fagin a much more sympathetic character. The idea of doing Oliver and Company came from storyman Pete Young and his wife. In fact, one of the most valuable takeaways from my interview with Mr. Scribner was about Jenny, the little girl who adopts Oliver. For years, I've been seeing people say that this was originally supposed to be a half-sequel to The Rescuers, and that Jenny was supposed to be Penny. The thing is, I never actually saw any official statement from Disney. No concept art, nothing. According to Scribner, Jenny was always Jenny, and was named after Pete Young's daughter. Any similarities are most likely a coincidence. So the next time you see someone mention that supposed fact, send them this video. Seriously, I need the views.
Pete Young, who I mentioned under, worked on Rescuers and did a lot of sketches of Penny. But Jenny was named after, Pete Young had 3 daughters, and it was one of his daughters. I wouldn't even say it was an influence. I'd say it really more of a coincidence than anything else.
The movie plays very fast and loose with the source material, although that's nothing new for Disney. The story went through a number of treatments, parts of which can be found scattered around the internet on auction sites. For a while, the plot revolved around Fagin and his gang planning a big heist. They were going to steal a panda from the Bronx Zoo and ransom it. Somehow, they pull it off, and Oliver befriends the little animal. Both he and the panda are kindred spirits, since neither of them belongs with this gang. In one proposed ending, Oliver would help the panda escape. Fagin and the dogs chase them, but fall off a drawbridge. The panda is returned to the zoo, and Oliver reunites with Jenny. Meanwhile, Fagin and the others have survived and are last seen on a garbage barge, planning to steal some koalas from the Washington Zoo. Other draft fragments imply that Sykes was involved in the panda plot, acting as the catalyst for why Fagin needed the money so badly. In one version, Fagin goes so far as to abandon his dogs when he tries to escape. Other concept art shows a very sleazy version of Sykes, decked out in a gold chain and nicknamed Psycho. Another piece of concept art even shows Nancy. According to Scribner, a lot of these were one-off ideas that were proposed and quickly discarded. Nancy, for instance, didn't seem to last long beyond those sketches. Although some art shows a very unpleasant Fagin, Scribner says the idea was always to have him be a kinder character than the Dickens story. He's a criminal, but he's in a desperate situation and he truly cares for his dogs, unlike the book version, who viewed the children as means to an end. It seems like a lot of work went into developing this character, including a backstory where he was raised in a Catholic orphanage. I wonder if this was perhaps to avoid the controversy of the original Fagin, who's often cited as a negative Jewish stereotype. With Fagin becoming a better person, the villain role went entirely to Sykes. The panda plot was deemed too complicated and dropped. The plot revolved much more around Oliver himself, which is probably how it always should have been. If anything, it manages to be just a tiny bit closer to the original story. Now Oliver is the one being ransomed, but it's clear that Fagin is only doing it because he's up against a wall. And even then, he ends up doing the right thing even when he knows there's a 99% chance it'll get him killed. Luckily, the odds are, for once, in his favor. Like I said, the movie is not without its comedy or lighthearted scenes, but the dark underbelly of city life is ever present. Sykes is not magic, nor is he terribly flamboyant or funny. He's a loan shark without a shred of mercy in his massive body. I've talked about how Cruella is an effective villain because entitled people like her really exist, and the same is even truer of Sykes. You can forget about the reality of the Cruellas of the world because the character is so over the top. Sykes is fairly down to earth as far as these kinds of villains go, which makes him feel even more realistic. That's not to say he doesn't have some of his own eccentricities. His 3 sunsets, 3 sunrises speech to Fagin is a little theatrical, but very memorable. He also has a hobby of building model cars, which is impressive given the size of his hands. Part of the reason Sykes is designed that way is because they originally wanted to keep him shrouded in the shadows, inspired by the Judge from The Natural. You would never get a good look at him, only his hands, so they were designed for that kind of emphasis. The shadowy Sykes would give the impression that Fagin wasn't just up against another person, he was up against an insurmountable force. This is still reflected visually in some scenes. In Sykes' introduction, Fagin is trapped between the Cadillac and a drop into the harbor. Trying to get away from the drop results in him getting choked by the car window and having smoke blown in his face. As the story developed, it became difficult to keep Sykes in the dark while having him actively pursuing the main characters. While Sykes is generally kept out of direct light in most shots, we ended up seeing a lot more of him than we were perhaps intended to. His main animator, Glenn Keane, expressed disappointment in some of the moments in the warehouse when we see him walking around like a normal person. He's still built like a brick house, but he's clearly human. A lot about Sykes remains a mystery. He operates from a warehouse in a shipyard. Lending money to hapless dopes like Fagin is probably just one of his professions. He seems to have some equally unsavory connections, as evidenced by a phone call we overhear.
What do you mean? You start with the knuckles? Yeah. No, you don't kill him yet.
There's an element of sadism at play, but the cruelest aspect of Sykes is that he simply does not care. When he sicks his Dobermans on Fagin, he doesn't even bother watching the carnage, focusing on model building instead. This is business as usual. He's not looking away out of repulsion, but out of boredom. Although it's not necessary, it's always interesting when a villain has parallels to the good guy. The most obvious is that both men have dogs to do their bidding. We'll hear more about Roscoe and DeSoto in a bit. The other thing is their desperation and need for cash. With Fagin, it makes sense given his circumstances. Sykes, meanwhile, lets his own greed get the better of him in the end. When the half-baked cat ransom plot fizzles out, he decides to cut his losses and kidnap Jenny instead. This is an incredibly risky move, since the girl now knows his face, his hideout, and even his pets. I have a feeling that Sykes was still planning to feed her to his dogs after he got the money and then lie low for a few years. When our heroes make their daring escape, Sykes finally snaps. We've seen him getting increasingly frustrated with Fagin, which is understandable, and Jenny's rescue is the final straw. Sykes chases them through the subway tunnel, not caring about what happens to his car or his dogs. This is no longer just business. Like the most famous mafia characters, he makes the mistake of letting things get personal. Sykes goes out in a blaze of glory, driving straight into an oncoming train. This, along with the deaths of the Horned King and Judge Doom, show an increasing trend of Disney villains getting taken out in a spectacular fashion. Sykes' gravelly voice was provided by Robert Loggia, who's no stranger to gangster roles. It's been said that Marlon Brando was offered the role and turned it down, but according to Scribner, this is also false. The film moved back toward conventional musicals, which Disney hadn't done in earnest for a while. But while the good guys got a chance to sing, the villains did not. That's an observation, not a complaint. I cannot, for the life of me, see Sykes bursting into song. The score was composed by Jack Redford, who has quite the impressive career. In addition to his many movie and concert works, he's orchestrated scores for a number of composers, including Danny Elfman, James Horner, and Thomas Newman. Oliver is a pretty theme-heavy score. Sykes' theme is not one that will instantly stick with you, but that's because it's kept low and ominous, fitting him perfectly. The ultimate hero-villain relationship in the movie is between Fagin and Sykes. In order to keep the focus on the animals, Sykes has some vicious guard dogs to assist him. Although concept art shows the Psycho Sykes version of the character with a bull terrier, like in the book, he eventually upgraded to a pair of intimidating Dobermans, Roscoe and DeSoto. In earlier drafts, the Dobermans actually killed Oliver's family, leaving the cat orphaned on the streets of New York. By virtue of what is described as a Dickensian coincidence, Oliver ends up in league with Fagin's gang, who are just as against the Dobermans as he is. While Oliver Twist is admittedly reliant on a number of coincidences, I prefer the opening they went with. Oliver is not the victim of a villain, he is a victim of an apathetic world. That feels more in line with Dickens' work in general. Another discarded idea was making the Dobermans the main foe of Einstein, the dim-witted Great Dane. Originally, Fagin brings him to Sykes' warehouse, where he fights them off and loses pretty badly. During the final chase through the subway, Einstein would get a burst of adrenaline and defeat the dogs in spite of his injuries. Seeing as Dodger is the main dog, it made more sense to give these moments to him instead. Unfortunately, that left Einstein with very little to do for most of the movie. We don't spend enough time with these dogs to fully gauge their personalities, but their introduction scene gives us a few hints. Roscoe, with the red collar, is voiced by Torian Black. He turns on the charm when flirting with Rita. Lesser dogs have probably fallen for his smoothness, but Rita is anything but a lesser dog. DeSoto with the blue collar is voiced by Carl Weintraub. He's a little more overtly aggressive and seems to be driven by appetite. He ignores the other dogs to sniff out little Oliver, who he fully intends to eat. This seems like it may have been a leftover from the movie's original opening. As far as criminals go, Sykes seems pretty professional and organized, at least until the end. It's surprising, then, that he does not have any henchmen other than the Dobermans. Scribner said he wanted to keep things simple, hence the elimination of Nancy early in the story process. All the story needs, villain-wise, is a loan shark and his two enforcers. He snaps his fingers, and they eat whoever can't pay him back. It's effective and efficient. Ignoring the practical narrative reason, I think Sykes only having his dogs says a lot about his character and the world he occupies. He's very self-assured for one thing, but he also must really trust these Dobermans. That's an interesting thing about Oliver. Many movies in a similar vein, like 101 Dalmatians or Lady and the Tramp, have the humans think of the animals as, well, animals. In this film, both Fagin and Sykes seem to be aware that their pets are actually quite intelligent. When Oliver and company rescue Jenny, Sykes is furious, but not surprised that a bunch of animals have pulled this off. With that logic, having Roscoe and DeSoto seems to be just as good as having a pair of human guards. He also just seems to be fond of the breed in general. His car has a Doberman-shaped hood ornament, and the license plate even says Doberman. While their deaths are not as explosive as Sykes, Roscoe and DeSoto both come to a pretty unpleasant end. After a brief but fierce battle with Dodger and Oliver, they fall onto the subway tracks and get electrocuted. You would not have seen this in a Disney movie 10 years prior. I'm not sure you'd even see this in a Disney movie today. I don't feel much sympathy for them, but it always makes me wince. Even though Fagin is free from debt, there's still a bittersweetness to the ending. Oliver gets to live happily ever after, but Fagin and his dogs are back to slumming it, doing their best on the streets. We hope that Fagin has learned something from this near-death experience, but who can really say? He has a good heart, but it's possible he'll end up owing another Sykes money very soon. It's interesting to see how morals in movies have changed since Disney's early days. As I previously covered, Walt struggled with the idea of making a movie about Renard the Fox for many years, but worried he couldn't make such a roguish character sympathetic enough. Worse, the censors, who were a lot harsher at the time, probably wouldn't approve of the protagonist who stole and lied for his own personal gain and got away with it. The many versions of Robin Hood got a pass because they were truly noble at heart and fighting against a greedy tyrant. I've referred to Fagin as a hero of sorts, but he's really not. Not most of the time, at least. He's lovable, interesting, and ultimately sympathetic, but it's the animals who do most of the actual heroics until the very end. A few years later, Disney would try another redemption story about a scrappy thief. No dogs here, but he had a monkey. Sykes is probably one of the classic villains with the least amount of appearances outside his original movie. McLeach from Rescuers Down Under is also quite rare, but he at least showed up in The House of Mouse, Once Upon a Studio, and the Battle Mode video game. These are tiny cameos, but it's more than Sykes can say. The only Sykes appearance that I can find, unless you are absolutely desperate and count his mention in Once Upon a Halloween, is a comic from the Netherlands. It seems to take place sometime during the movie. A sick Fagin sends his dogs out to steal for him in hopes of paying off Sykes. Oliver feels like he's too small to help, but tries to steal a crate of canned food from a cargo ship anyway. The crate is too big for him to move much, so the kitten gives up. At that moment, Sykes comes driving along, ready to collect what Fagin owes him. He ends up hitting the crate Oliver has left in his path, causing him and his dogs to land in the harbor and giving Fagin a little more time. A video game was released for the Amiga shortly after the movie came out. There's very little information on it, but from what I gather, the final level takes place in the warehouse. Oliver has to collect musical notes or something, and then uses Francis to save Jenny? It's not really clear what's going on, but on the left of the screen, you can see one of the Dobermans in the elevator slowly descending, so I think there's supposed to be a timer of some sort. Either way, Sykes himself is absent. Speaking of, although Sykes was not in the House of Mouse, DeSoto made an appearance. In a surprisingly friendly turn of events, he joined Dodger and the other dogs in barking out a canine version of Everybody Wants to Be a Cat. I've seen people say that DeSoto's design was also used in some episodes of Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers and Goof Troop, but there are some subtle differences. It's not a one-to-one copy-paste like the many appearances of the Peter Pan crocodile. I think this can be more chalked up to there only being so many ways you can draw a Doberman. Even if we don't count these cartoons, Sykes' dogs have still had more appearances than him. So why is it that we barely see Sykes? Well, it could be that he's just too realistic a character. His massive physique aside, there's nothing fantastical about Sykes. That's not to say he's not a powerful villain. He's exactly what the story needed, and he played the role well. But most of the Disney villains that frequently appear have something flashy about them. Magic powers, maniacal laughter, outrageous costumes, memorable songs. Sykes doesn't really fall into this category. And although he poses a powerful threat, he doesn't really fit in with the other group of bad guys. The overtly scary demonic ones like Chernabog, the Horned King, or even the Coachman. Sykes is something of a misfit. While Oliver, Dodger, and some of the other dogs still pop up from time to time, Sykes has mostly been left in the 80s. Hopefully this video can remind everyone that he's a strong villain in his own right, even if you probably won't run into him at Disney World. Just for the sake of mentioning, Disney has revisited Oliver Twist twice since the animated film. A live-action made-for-TV movie in 1997 featured Richard Dreyfuss as Fagin and David O'Hara as Sykes. Disney Plus has The Artful Dodger, a sequel to the book following Dodger's life as a reformed surgeon in Australia. Fagin, played by David Thewlis, has survived the events of the book and shows up to cause trouble for his old pupil. Given the short length of this entry, I thought this would be a nice place to stick a pair of bonus comic villains I've wanted to talk about for a while. In a sense, they tie into Sykes thematically. Both characters are supposedly reputable businessmen, but they barely hide their dark, nasty sides. Our first character was created by Walt Disney himself. In the earliest days of the long-running Mickey Mouse newspaper strip, Disney did the writing. This changed pretty quickly, with Floyd Gottfredson becoming the main writer for a long while, but Walt worked on the comic long enough to introduce a villain, Sylvester Shyster, the lawyer. When Sylvester first appears, he seems like an honest, charming gentleman. Minnie is set to inherit a mansion that belonged to her Uncle Mortimer. No, not Mr. Ha-Cha-Cha, he came later. And Shyster wants to buy it from her. Mickey is suspicious, and when Minnie hesitates, Shyster drops the nice guy act almost instantly. He hires an early, almost unrecognizable Peg-Leg Pete and his gang of thugs to put the squeeze on the mice, but it's to no avail. It turns out he doesn't want the mansion, he just wants the treasure map hidden inside. This leads to one of Mickey's first great adventures, as he and Minnie race Pete and Shyster to Death Valley for the loot. As the journey continues, we see how the villain's dynamic works. Shyster calls the shots, and Pete is the dumb muscle. The two trade insults constantly, but Shyster usually comes out on top. They wind up double-crossing each other, which is to be expected from such untrustworthy characters. They make amends near the end of the treasure hunt, and oddly enough, the twisted friendship seems to stick. Although Shyster is still the dominant one, he and Pete seem to realize they work very well as a team, and continue to plague Mickey's life for a number of years. No matter what terrible state they're left in at the end of the story, they wind up back on their feet and worse than ever, thirsty for revenge. Their craziest scheme involved building a giant pirate dirigible where they ruled supreme. Another memorable story had Shyster and Pete gamble over who got to marry Minnie. Minnie, of course, had no say in the matter. Shyster's backstory is mostly a mystery, but we learn one interesting thing. Sometime in the past, he and Pete were part of the good Captain Churchmouse's crew. the villains led a mutiny, leaving Church Mouse marooned on an island where he became a Ben Gunn-inspired hermit. Since then, the Crooks have instigated several other crews to mutiny. It's an odd talent to have, but I'll admit they're very good at it. After some exciting story arcs, Shyster and Pete more or less parted ways in the mid-30s. They teamed up again once in the early 40s before Shyster took an extended retirement, only sticking his head out every now and then. He hadn't been a lawyer since his first appearance. Being a convicted felon probably made it harder to find clients or a court that would take him. I have a feeling he'd been doing plenty of dishonest work long before this. Mickey's just the one who exposed it. Gradually, Shyster has made his way back into the spotlight. He still teams up with Pete every now and then, and even puts his law skills to use. Or should I say misuse. A very fun story has Mickey getting arrested in a bizarre foreign country for climbing a tree. This is apparently against the law, even when Mickey tries to explain he was doing it to help an old lady retrieve her cat. Shyster is appointed as his lawyer, and he actually seems to be making a halfway decent effort to defend the mouse. The country's backwards legal system is just tricky to navigate. It's revealed that Shyster was disguised as the old lady and has been trying to get Mickey jailed. Fortunately for Mickey, and unfortunately for Shyster, impersonating an old lady is the country's worst offense. Mickey is off the hook, and Shyster is in very hot water. He might not be Mickey's most well-known adversary, but as far as the comics are concerned, Shyster was his first. He even claims to have hated Mickey longer than anyone, which, based on the comic's vague timeline, is technically true. I should also mention that the Uncle Scrooge stories feature another evil lawyer, coincidentally sharing Shyster's first name. Sylvester J. Sharkey has appeared a number of times to plague the Ducks, often serving Azure Blue, who claims to rightfully own North America. Sharkey often uses Latin legal jargon to suit his needs. He'll spout what amounts to gibberish, claiming it as law, and no one knows enough Latin to disprove him. He's a fun character, written to be as frustrating as possible. Actually, that applies to our next villain as well. Like Shyster, Eli Squinch was created, or at least suggested, by Walt Disney. Despite this being the case with both villains I'm covering, this really wasn't a common occurrence for comic characters. Squinch first entered Mickey's life when the mouse accidentally won a baby elephant in an auction. A very typical, relatable problem. As it turns out, Squinch bought the elephant beforehand, but there is a major postal mix-up. The old codger wants to use Bobo the elephant to power his mill, something that will most likely kill the creature with how demanding Squinch will be. Because animal abuse laws weren't the best in the 30s, Mickey has to find a way to keep Bobo safe that somehow works within the law. To some extent, if you ignore the exploitation of a baby elephant, we can understand Squinch's point of view. He bought Bobo, and legally has the right to take him. He's just incredibly obstinate the whole time. Even when he sees that Bobo is far too small to be of real use, he still insists on taking his property, and refuses to make a deal to sell him until he's put in a position where he absolutely has to. No matter how accommodating everyone is to Squinch, he remains crotchety and nasty for the whole story. In the end, Bobo gets to stay with his mother at the circus, and Squinch gets his money back. Of course, if that was all Squinch did, I wouldn't be covering him. This thoroughly unpleasant character has returned several times, often with a much worse plan in mind. His second appearance had him court Clarabelle Cow in order to get at a treasure map in her attic. His grandpa, Buzzard Squinch, knew Clarabelle's grandfather, and was aware of the treasure he had hidden in the desert. Mickey and Horace Horsecollar get the map first and head out to find the treasure. Squinch is close on their heels, along with his hired help, Pegleg Pete. This is probably sounding awfully familiar to you right now, since in a lot of ways, it's a more polished remake of the first treasure hunt story written 5 years prior. One of the biggest differences is the stakes involved. Clarabelle needs the money to pay her mortgage. Squinch, always ready to aim at someone's weak spot, buys the mortgage to her house. Now she owes him, and if he gets the treasure first, she's guaranteed to lose everything. The treasure hunt essentially ends in a draw. Clarabelle gets the money, but has to pay most of it to Squinch, who leaves in a huff. He tries to kill Mickey and Horace several times over the course of the adventure, and ultimately walks away angry, but richer. Like the Bobo story, Squinch largely gets away with his misdeeds. He's very much a figure in the vein of Mr. Potter from It's Wonderful Life. Rich in wealth, but poor in spirit. Mickey Mouse, the George Bailey character, has the real happy ending, but we can't help wishing that Squinch got an actual punishment for the trouble he caused the heroes. Squinch is very similar to Shyster, especially considering they both frequently work with Pete. I feel that Squinch might actually be the worst of the two. Shyster has done some truly devious things, but everyone knows his evil nature. Squinch is very plainly an untrustworthy bully, but he somehow manages to keep a somewhat good professional reputation. Shyster barely gets to be a lawyer anymore, but Squinch still functions in the business world. One of the most notable quirks with this character is his way of speaking. If you've been reading the panels, you'll see that Squinch has a very colorful dialect, apparently based on old-timey Massachusetts speech patterns. It makes him a very fun character to read, and it adds a lot of color to his stories. In general, I think Squinch is an underrated villain. He's not Mickey's deadliest foe, but he's probably the slipperiest, since he usually avoids comeuppance. They did a great job creating a thoroughly unlikable yet entertaining character who we can actively root against. Like Sykes, see, I'm tying this back to Oliver and Company, there are people like Squinch who really exist. They use the law to take advantage of vulnerable victims, and they get away with it more often than they should. Even if Mickey can't punish him too harshly, he can at least put a stop to his evil plans and give help to those who need it. This was a short entry, but it's actually kind of nice to have a little break between larger videos. I'd like to thank George Scribner for answering my questions and giving some more insight into this movie's production. Our next entry will take us back to the small screen, but not quite as small as our heroes. We'll be looking at Fat Cat, Professor Nimnol, and a few other villains who went up against the Rescue Rangers.
R as in Robert Loggia. O as in, oh my God, it's Robert Loggia. B as in, by God, that's Robert Loggia. E as in...